Robert Keefer joins me to discuss gluten-free recipe design. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 198. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 198, and it's late August 2019. Robert Keefer joins me to discuss gluten-free beer recipe design. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Every issue of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine is packed with articles for homebrewers and beer lovers. They're currently offering 20% off their all-access subscription pass, with access to videos, brewing courses, exclusive articles, and the Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Go to beerandbrewing.com/beersmith to get your all-access pass today. Again, that's beerandbrewing.com/beersmith. And also the Brew Commander. The Brew Commander is a new brew house controller from Blickman Engineering. It's available in electric and gas propane models. The patent-pending Brew Commander is an innovative, high-quality brew house controller with ultra-high precision, the ultimate in flexibility. Whether integrated or freestanding, the Brew Commander offers automated step mashing, boil timers, and amazing advanced settings. Command your brew day with the new Brew Commander from Blickman Engineering. To order yours today, visit blickmanengineering.com for more information. Again, that's blickmanengineering.com. And finally, BeerSmith 3 is available now for download, and also the mobile version's out. BeerSmith 3 adds mead, wine, and cider recipe support to the BeerSmith platform, along with new integrated water profile and mash pH tools. Dozens of new features, including cloud folders, updated databases, support for fruit juice, honey, as well as new Whirlpool hop options. Download your free 21-day trial today from beersmith.com and give it a try. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, I welcome back Robert Keefer. Robert has a lot of experience in gluten-free brewing using alternative grains, and he's written articles for Beer Own Magazine as well as other publications. Today, he joins us to discuss making beer with gluten-free grains. It's great to have you back on the show, Robert. How are you doing?
Great to be back. Thanks for having me, Brad.
Always a pleasure. And I understand today we're going to dive a little bit into gluten-free brewing. What have you been up to the last year and a half, I guess? Because things have changed quite a bit for you, I think, since the last time we talked to you.
Yes, I have been very busy. I, with my wife, started a gluten-free brewery. We're currently contract brewing right now, but we're in the Southern California market. Very excited. Just got into a brand, Total Wine. Some people are familiar with it. Very excited about that. So just hoping to continue building it from there.
So I'm sorry, you got into Total Wine, you said?
Yeah, we just recently delivered to 13 Southern California stores. So we're all the way from Thousand Oaks to Palm Desert down to Temecula now.
Nice. And what's the name of your brewery?
Divine Sciences Brewing.
And you are, where do you have a tasting room or someplace folks can taste it?
Soon with our newest contract brewer, there is a possibility that we'll be on tap there, but we are on tap throughout LA and Orange County, as not only in cans but also on tap as well.
Nice. And what styles of beers are you making? I know you only got a few at this point, I think, right?
Yeah, you can have anything you want from us as long as it's the IPA.
That's pretty much all Southern California, isn't it? IPA, right?
It is a big IPA haven for sure. I guess we're really excited to release a new flavor though, because there are people that do have 8 taps and they're like, "What else you got?" I got 4 IPAs on.
Well, today we're going to dive into some of the challenges with recipe design and gluten-free brewing. And I do a lot of speaking and talking about recipe design for conventional beers. How is your approach to recipe design a little bit different?
The world is your oyster, as long as it's not made with barley, wheat, or rye. Honestly, the ingredients that I've seen people putting into gluten-free beers is incredible, and it really kind of brings back to mind this kind of Renaissance feel that it's very undefined. And a lot of the flavors I would even suggest, shouldn't even necessarily be mimicked by name, at least, because we are really dealing with an entire different palette of ingredients.
And what are some of your favorite grains that you use instead of barley?
there's a long list, but I would say the kind of the short list would be millet, rice, sorghum, buckwheat, corn to start off. And then we could kind of, depending on what's local to you, then we could talk about your options therein, with specific grains like amaranth, teff, quinoa, and some of the other, it gets deeper. I mean, some people use sunflower seeds. Some people use lentils. Some people use chestnuts. There's an incredible long list of ingredients you can use once you actually start moving away from barley as your main base ingredient.
And how do the flavors reflect in these different grains? Do we end up with something that tastes like? I mean, is your goal to make something like barley beer?
I'd say that at first, when I started gluten-free homebrewing, that was the initial goal. And then I started noticing there was some distinct flavors that once I started leaning into, created incredible experiences. Like just take the grapefruit note that seems to come from the sorghum when it's fermented. You can use an incredible hop palette and lean into that grapefruit flavor and make, incredibly delicious beers with it.
And what are you using in your initial beers that you're commercially making? What are you using as a base primarily?
Yeah, so I use millet and rice as my base ingredient for the IPA. And millet is about 60%, or I would say maybe even closer to 70% of the grist at this point.
And then rice, of course, doesn't have a lot of flavor to it, but it provides some alcohol, right?
Absolutely. There is a little bit of mouthfeel that I noticed that is specific to rice that, say, is different when you just use just millet or just sorghum, or, I mean, even just rice beer has its own texture that I'd say kind of is unique to rice. So there is some textural elements. I use the rice also for color because millet doesn't really have a lot of husk. Rice does, so it really helps with not only the filtration, but then I can also buy some of the roasted or different color malts from Eckert Malting and Brewing, which is in Chico, California. They do all different kinds of rice. I mean, it's really impressive what he's been able to do with not just the color palette, but also the flavors, because he has flavors that are very, very similar to, say, your traditional two-row.
And is that in the roasted grains or the traditional base grains?
So he's got, pale rice, biscuit rice, crystal, Cara. He has one that he calls James Brown, and I love the ideas and the creativity that he's been able to do with these grains. He also does dehusked as well, which is great for if you are doing an all rice beer, you really don't need all that husk, and a lot of that husk is going to carry over into the taste profile. So you can buy kind of a mixed grist of dehusked and husked rice. And make an incredible beer with just rice. Yeah,
I'm thinking of rice hulls that we use, of course, right? Use with traditional beers to keep them from sticking, right, during the mash.
Exactly, and that is another great reason to use rice in your gluten-free brewing recipes. Some of the ingredients like the sunflower seeds, buckwheat, which aren't actually grains themselves, they're seeds. That come from like flowers. So they have a different composition. That's not only what contributes to a different taste profile, but what also leads to a different mash viscosity, because you're dealing with things like beta glucans and higher contents, almost on the same content level as ingredients like rye and wheat.
Mm-hmm. Well, wheat obviously has tremendous amount of proteins in it. What are we using to get typical barley beer flavors out of it? Is it a combination of roast grains, the base grains we talked about?
Yeah, and then I think there's a lot of hop flavor that also is there to a beer, because sometimes malty can just be clean and sweet depending on your base ingredient. I see the best flavor parallels coming from usually a layering of gluten-free malts. Honestly, in my experience, right? So I would probably use a little bit of pale rice with a little bit of biscuit rice, But then I would also have, a bigger amount of millet in there. So probably use like at least 9 to 10 pounds in a 5-gallon batch of pale millet with about 1.5 pounds of those two kind of grains mixed in there as a good, not only filtration system, but also good flavor and color profile that's going to mimic two-row barley. And then, there's a couple different kind of things that you can do with things like buckwheat and other ingredients, specifically like oats or lentils or chestnuts even. You can kind of pepper those into your mash in smaller doses. So I make a hefelinsel, so to speak. It's actually a derivation of a friend, Ed Golden. He was the one that brought a beer like that to our gluten-free homebrew club's club night at HomebrewCon last year, and it was fascinating to me because it was a great flavor comparison with your average Hefeweizen. And I think it really goes to show that a lot of the flavors that you really get in beers do come from the yeast and the hops. And the malts, you can mimic, but also in a sense I have this saying, right? If you use sorghum as your base malt and you use Saaz hops and you use a lager yeast, technically you made a Pilsner, but it wasn't made with Pilsner malt. So you shouldn't call it a Pilsner. Maybe you could call it a Silsner.
Well, that's interesting. One of the things you said did catch my attention. We were talking about the layering of flavors. That's a concept that I advocate a lot. Using different types of grains, different colors of grain to get that layering, to get depth. You must have to do it here, obviously.
Oh, especially in certain beers like saisons. I would use buckwheat. I would use millet, rice, but then I also might add something else to there. You're going to be able to extract different flavors with different yeast, but there's also this aspect where saisons have that peppery note. So using something like a buckwheat, which naturally has kind of a spice or a clove element to it, when fermented with a saison, I really have seen it bring out, amazing green peppers and red peppers and white peppers that you sometimes don't get with, say, like a barley and wheat grist in a saison.
And in addition, I think color's an issue. You mentioned the example of trying to take gluten-free bread and toast it. What happens there, right?
Yeah, so I like to give an anecdotal story here where I've put gluten-free bread in the toaster and put it to like the darkest setting, and it comes out white. And then you basically put it down, but within like a minute, it's burnt all of a sudden. What? Okay. How did we go? How did that happen? And, I think it's just, you're looking at a different composition of ingredients. A lot of times they're higher in pH. There's also sometimes less sugars in some of them, not necessarily rice, but some of the other ones. And there's this element where you see it mimicking in the roaster, where you can go from 0 to 180 in a matter of seconds in terms of Levibond. And that's where you see flavors like French roast millet, which you'd think would almost be like a dark roast itself. It has a dark roast flavor, but it really turns the beer red in my experience. So there's you can get like almost like a stout-like flavor in a beer, but it wouldn't be dark enough to really label it a stout. So it's really actually kind of interesting because you can do a lot with that once you kind of realize that it's not always just color-based that you're getting a flavor from. So, you just take example like roasts like Vienna and Munich in the millet spectrum. When you look at Grouse's, I would say it's more of a texturing or it's a gradient, if you will. There's like grains in there that are clearly 1-2 Levibond, and then there's grains in there that are also like 20 to 40 Levibond. And so you're probably going to get close to a Munich color or a Vienna color at some point, but you're still going to probably want to use a caramel malt or a crystal malt to actually get that color of a Vienna lager or say a Munich, Dunkel or something like that.
I mean, one of the challenges is that even the SRM scale is just a one-dimensional scale, and so it doesn't capture things like subtle hues of red or even any of the other colors. Really, it's you're taking really a three-dimensional thing. There's three different primary colors that are mixed together, and trying to turn it into a one-dimensional thing. So,
very true.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what are some of the tricks you can use to get the perfect color out of your beer?
Well, I think that one of the biggest keys in the homebrew setting is figuring out that best way to crash it or getting that flocculent yeast. There's a fair amount of good dry yeasts that I could recommend that would be really great for not only maybe a uncontrolled temperature ferment, but also would still flock out and give you that clarity that will really kind of lend to what the actual color was that you're going for.
Yeah, I got it confused a little bit there. I asked you about color and you started talking about the yeast, but I guess clarity is an issue as well, right?
Yeah. So I've had beers that I, set out to make an amber, and it really looked more like a golden. So I think that's an important aspect in just, the kind of the 101 setting. But if I'm looking at, say, making an amber that's gluten-free, that's exciting. There's a lot that I could do with it. I would start with probably, obviously the pale millet, but then I would put in maybe a little bit of chocolate millet malt in there, maybe anywhere between 4 to 12 ounces, and then I'd add in it's about maybe around the same amount of French roast, and then I'd probably put a little bit of crystal rice in there, maybe a little bit of amber rice as well. And that would kind of give me a texturing of, caramel, but also just a little bit of that, darker note, but not too much. And then I'd probably hop it with something like a Northern Brewer, or something of that varietal, something that does have that bitter note, but not overpowering. So I still get that balance.
Yeah. Do you run into challenges doing really dark beers like stouts or sweet stouts or, something that doesn't have a burnt roasted character to it?
Sweet stout. That's funny to say in gluten-free space, because it is really hard to do. You have to basically start at a higher gravity point and finish at a much higher gravity point than you would expect, like 1035, really, to get a sweet stout that's gluten-free. The grains naturally already feel and palate lighter too. They don't have that extra thicker protein, that gluten. It's a long chain protein. So, if we're looking at a recipe, I've had people say, this is a great replica of a dry Irish stout. And I'm like, oh, well, I set out to make a sweet stout, but thank you. So it's definitely a fun thing to consider. So take the group brew that I did this past January with the Zero Tolerance Gluten-Free Homebrewing Club. We had an annual party up at Groundbreaker Brewing in Portland, and we brewed an imperial, what is now going to be a barrel-aged stout. And it is going to have a little bit of some of those oak chips in it as well that are going to be, have a little bit of bourbon on them. But we're also going to put some dark cherries in there. I think the big thing that's been the focus with this beer is, for me, is to just make the biggest gluten-free beer that I know made to this point. I think our starting Play-Doh was 32 bricks Play-Doh.
Wow. That's pretty high, I would think.
Yeah,
sounds like some meads I made.
Yeah, we were coming out of the mash, and he was giving me the reading, and I was like, okay, well, we're probably gonna have to add a fair amount of extracts in the boil, and let's do maybe a 2-hour boil as well. And he's like, really? Are you sure? I'm like, yeah. I really want to make it as big as I can, and give me the slowest moving yeast you have.
I mean, you're talking about 32 bricks. That's you multiply by 4 roughly, and that's in the realm of what you would start a wine at, probably. It's over 1,100, right?
Yeah. So it was, I think, maybe like 11. I think that when we did the conversion, it was 1150 or 1250, something in that range. That's what I was looking for.
Yeah, that'd be like a good wine.
Yeah.
Now,
Well, why not?
does that all ferment away? How does that work? Do you end up with do you end up with a, like a 12, it's really really wine territory. Do you end up with like a 12 or 13% alcohol thing?
That's the hope. I mean, I've made IPAs that projected around 15% at home before. So I figured I could do it with the stout. We used Empire Ale yeast from Mangrove Jack's, the M15. I've seen that do really well. And then it really wasn't temperature controlled, so I don't think it'll have too much of that appley note that sometimes you get from the that fruity pear, like sometimes you get from the English ale yeasts.
Yeah, they have a lot of esters.
But even so, that would work with what we're doing. That I think that it wouldn't conflict with the dark. I even put cacao nibs in the mash. We did a lot of chocolate roast. We did all like a dusting of all different kind of extracts that are gluten free. So we did a lot of the Belgian candy syrups. We did like D90 and we did D180, but we also did the double X, the midnight dark. And then we did like tapioca and a little bit of sorghum in there. It was like, I think we probably used just about every single gluten-free ingredient that you can use, because we even had lentils and chestnuts in there with millet and rice. I guess the only thing that was missing was I think we actually put maltodextrin in there, so that would be corn. So I really was trying to do a full homage to gluten-free brewing with that recipe.
Nice. Well, we've been talking about this for a few minutes, but getting enough body into the beer is also difficult because a lot of the grains just don't have those long protein chains. You mentioned gluten's a long molecule chain. What are some of the things you can do as you're designing gluten-free beer to get around that?
I think that there's something to say about sugar helping to have a certain level of thickness, but you don't want to have that cloying. You don't want to have that syrupy vibe, especially if you're brewing anything other than a sweet stout. I think that there's been a couple.
So are you talking about using sugar as a fermentable ingredient or adding it after?
I would say, I would say unfermentable sugars.
Oh,
right?
okay.
So,
yeah, of course.
So you can use things like lactose. You can use things like maltodextrin. There's also a certain level of body that you can get from other ingredients like buckwheat or sunflower seeds, which are high protein. Then you may struggle with beta glucan. So you'd want to incorporate a beta glucan rest into your mash if you're using those types of ingredients. I'd say buckwheat really responds to the temperature of 135 degrees Fahrenheit.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be a great mash-in temperature if you're using an ingredient like buckwheat. I find that within 15 minutes, I get a pillowy texture that does not create any difficulties downstream in terms of, say, sparge. So I've gotten stuck mashes with sunflower seeds though. So that's where you really want to be, cognizant of the beta glucan rest. It really does help. But those things do really contribute a fair amount of protein. I've gotten some, and then you can use things like lentils too. High protein stuff is good for head retention. Sometimes dry hopping is a good idea, but sometimes it's not to style. So,
you mentioned no barley, wheat, rye, or can you use oats? I have no idea. Oats?
Some people can do it. Some people have an avenin allergy associated with their gluten allergy.
Oh, okay.
So there is some use with oats. You wouldn't want to use it as a base ingredient though. It's going to create like an oatmeal mash, if you will, there.
Obviously you can't, if you go overboards with the oats, you end up with an oily mess, quite honest.
That's my like first brew I ever did. I'll raise my hand to that one because I really didn't know anything about, brewing at that point. And I was like, well, oats are the easiest thing to buy, so why not? And no, it was great. I'm glad I didn't record that one.
Often the grains have to be mashed using a different schedule and probably dependent on which grain you're using too. Can you give us maybe a few examples of some of the mash schedules and how things respond, how some of the different base grains even will respond to different mash schedules?
So for the longest time, the going philosophy is hit the midpoint of as many of the grains as you have in the mash as your base infusion temperature.
Mm-hmm.
So that meant about 163.4 degrees Fahrenheit. It was very specific, but it seemed to work for some people.
So is the idea they're trying to just do a single temperature, or you're not doing a multi-step mash, or?
I say step mash works best, especially if you're going to go for the right tastes and, a lot of other things. I would say you don't have to sacrifice all your enzymes, really. There is some enzymes in ingredients like millet and buckwheat, not so much rice, not so much corn, but some of those do have some. And so you could mash in at like a temperature like 165, and you're already going to buy probably an exogenous alpha amylase and probably
we're going to talk about enzymes next. So, but
yeah, well, and that's the thing with mash temperatures is that certain enzymes work at better temperatures, right? So I would say since millet is usually going to be your base grain, it is sometimes a good idea to say mash in at a way higher temperature, like a 175 or 185, depending on how much temperature you lose and how much pound of grain you're using. You could bring a nice high strike temperature. You're already going to add exogenous enzymes back, so why not just get it to liquefy the sugars so that you can gelatinize them with an enzyme. So and then I've been able to get mashes down to pretty quick now just because of that. A lot of people are mashing for like up to 4 hours in certain cases.
Wow.
Which I think is almost overkill, because I've been able to do less than 90-minute mashes now, and some on the order of like an hour and 20, and still getting the same, not only mash clarity, but also the same sugar extraction. And that's just from, utilizing the fact that I'm actually using distillers enzymes.
So are you mashing at a single temperature then? Like you mentioned the 160 something?
I've done that.
Fahrenheit, obviously. I can't do the math in my head for.
Neither can I. I think it's somewhere in the 67 to 70 degrees Celsius, something like that. I forget. But I've talked to a lot of people that are like, 163, why so high? Right? And there's just this aspect of, you even see it with a lot of the enzymes, honestly. Like, I think most of the B-rest or beta amylase enzyme, they work better between 145 and 155, as opposed to the alpha amylase, which works better between like 155 and 165. So, there's certain stuff that I've kind of started doing at home where I've been getting the strike water hot, adding the alpha amylase, which is most commonly termamyl, which is a distiller's enzyme that works up to like 220 degrees Fahrenheit. And so it doesn't necessarily matter what temperature you add it at. You can add it in super hot. It gets itself activated and going. You mash in all the enzymes, and I get like a foam off of that, honestly, as it's liquefying all of those starches. And then that honestly will bring the temperature down about 15 to 20 degrees sometimes. Or I can recirc till it gets to that temperature with the top of the mash kettle open.
So you start with the mash hot and then go cooler over time? Is that what you're doing?
Yeah, that's what I do. And then I'll wait like 20 minutes, and then I'll add the secondary enzyme that gelatinizes all the starches. And honestly, it'll work in like 5 to 10 minutes. It's pretty crazy. So but that's because they're concentrated, and they're supposed to be used for people that are extracting everything to get it down to like a 20% beer that's going to then turn into a 40% whiskey.
Yeah, I just did the math here. So 163 Fahrenheit is 72.8 degrees Celsius, so almost 73 degrees Celsius. Well, let's talk about enzymes. You've already dived into it a little bit, but the enzymes, sounds like the enzymes and the mash schedule are very closely tied together. And many of these grains don't have enough native enzymes in the grain itself to self-convert like barley does, right?
Exactly. So there's been a very big focus on being very delicate with certain aspects of barley. I see a lot of recipes out there that say 149, 150, 151 as the rest temperature. We really don't mind because there really isn't there's really not even a lot of beta amylase. So there is some alpha amylase in millet. Like I'd say it's about 40 points, but barley outweighs it by like 300% at 120 points.
Oh yeah, yeah. Especially modern base malts are very have very high quantities of enzymes. So
true, and the fact still remains that these are malted ingredients. So they've been malted. There have been some tests done at the homebrew and now at the commercial scale where maltsters are thinking about adding enzyme water to the, say, crystals and actually making fully converted starch crystal malts, as opposed to where if you look at some of the pictures of the crystal malts that we have available right now in the gluten-free space, you look at the, an up-close microscope view of it, you're not looking at all the way glass like you do when you look at, say, a barley crystal. When you look at a millet crystal, you're still seeing about 20% starch content in there, if not more in certain cases, if you're looking at grain by grain basis. So some are more, some are less, and that comes from the fact that while millet does have enzymes, it's not able to fully convert itself. So that's something that's really important to note just on that scale itself. And that's where I think that's where the question of color really does come into effect in a certain case, because you're not getting the same aspects that you would from a barley crystal from a millet crystal.
Interesting. What are some of the enzymes that you actually use? Are they commercially available, easy to get from a homebrew store? And you mentioned a distiller's enzyme as well.
Yeah. So termamyl is the typically liquefaction enzyme. I mean, you can use CBamyl BAL 100 as your alpha amylase. That one, though, isn't really effective past 167. So that's where if you are mashing it at 165, it's a great one to use. But if you're, say, mashing it at 175, 185, a termamyl is going to be a better idea. And then I typically use CBamyl L for my secondary gelatinization enzyme. And I think there's one or two others that are available.
So help me out. So the mashing process, you add at least 2 enzymes during the process, right? Can you walk us through that?
Yeah. And so there is starches in there, and you don't have the 2 enzymes that barley has that are going to cut those different starches into sugars that are available, right? So I'm not the biggest sugar chain expert, but what I do know is that you need to cleave it into a dextrin, which then can be, I think, cleaved one more time, or it's the other way around. But the biggest focus on that is to create fermentable sugars.
Right. You're taking longer molecule longer starch chains and breaking them down into things that the yeast can actually eat or convert.
Right. Specifically glucose, but there's also, I think, a peppering of maltose and maltotriose and a couple of those in there. But primarily, I see a lot of these ferments behaving like glucose fermentations, where I'll have a beer that I really set out to make a 4.5, maybe 5% beer that ferments out to about 6.5, because it should have stopped at 10, 12, but stopped at 0.
So these enzymes are pretty effective. So walk us through, again, I was asking for the, you added one enzyme of some type up front, then you mentioned use a second one up later in the process?
Yeah. So an enzyme like termamyl likes higher temperatures, really. And so I'll add that before I even mash in, so that it's just like an enzyme-rich water that I'm now dumping in my millet or rice, or a texturing of there with like corn or buckwheat or whatever the beer style that I'm making is, and then I'll vigorously stir that to make sure I get full surface area touching the enzyme. Usually at that point I've lost about 15 degrees Fahrenheit, somewhere up. Sometimes it's been 20 degrees Fahrenheit. And right about that point, I'm at like 160 or 155. And 155 is a great temperature for CBMLL. I think it works really great at that temperature. However, there are times where you don't say get all the way there, and then it's a great time to start Vorolofing just right there, because you're really, once you've got a full, touching, the mash is all touching itself, you're going to have a lot of liquefaction of starch right there. So you can give it some time. But these are really fast working chemicals, and I'm using about like. I'd say 25 milliliters is a great. I call it a heaping tablespoon, just because like I'm pouring it till it's like kind of overflowing a little bit, and then letting the rest drop in. And that usually serves me right. But if you really want to get down to the technical bit, that's really what they suggest that you're using at, say, like you're going into about a 5.5 gallon ferment. That's what you're going to want to have in your mash, at least, because you're probably going to use anywhere between 12 to 15 pounds of grain. If you're using all rice, you're going to need to use about 20 pounds, and you're probably going to want a bigger mash tun. There's also certain considerations with doing more concentrated wort, especially if you are getting good drainage with, say, rice. So that would sometimes be my recommendation is like go big, and then try to do things where you've got maybe a slow moving yeast or a yeast that doesn't have a high alcohol tolerance. I see, 05 from Fermentis fermenting out a lot of things. But if you add something like a maltodextrin back in there and you just have that as part of your base recipe process, it's not going to finish out all the way. And so it's going to keep that residual body that you're looking for. And then the fact that you have, some protein content in millet, some protein content in things like buckwheat, you're going to have still that, same beer experience that you would have with barley.
Now, is it the enzymes that are driving the final gravity low, or is it just the low protein content of the grains primarily? The finishing gravity, you usually mentioning up with fairly low finishing gravities.
I think the enzymes do have a role to play in the fact that, a lot of yeasts are really glucose hungry, and they'll just go nuts for it. That being said,
I'll just say, for example, I had Mitch Steele on a few weeks back, and he was talking about they're making this new Brute IPA, and they basically add the enzyme to it, and it, finishes with a very low, like sub 1.0 finishing gravity, and it's a traditional barley beer.
A gluten-free brewer would say something cheeky like, "Oh, that's cute, Brute IPA."
I think it's a bit of a fad, but it's I guess some people are enjoying them.
And the reason why I say that though is because I think that a lot of us have set out to make IPAs that are gluten-free, but have made triple IPAs because it finished at 0 Plato. And I think that there's this aspect where we're like, "Oh, you guys want it to get that low? That's funny," because that's every time we make an IPA, we're like struggling to make sure it has enough of that residual sweetness or body to balance the hops.
I guess my only point was that they do that just by adding enzymes, basically.
True, and that's what we kind of do to make the grains work for us. I think that there's I think there may be something in the future of gluten-free brewing where we're able to have an enzyme malt, or we're able to have a something. It'll be very interesting to see that come to fruition. I think that's the big thing that really helps the cost scale. I mean, there's a reason why you're paying a little bit more for gluten-free craft beer out there, is because the cost of ingredients is a massive difference. I think there's been certain gluten-free brewers that I could quote that say, if you want to make an affordable pint of gluten-free beer, you have to make terms with ingredients like sorghum and sweet candy syrup and sugar, as opposed to using all malt beers. There's some really great examples of all malt beers out there. I mean, but even say our IPA at Divine Science, we still, for our base recipe, it does have organic cane sugar in it. And that helps us get to the gravity reliably, because there are days where you get a 14.6 extraction on Plato on, your malt bill, or there are some days where you get a 13.6 extraction on your malt bill. And I'm not trying to dump that, and I'm not trying to make less beer.
Yeah, I understand. Well, so what are some of the tricks you can use to keep make the finishing gravity come out reasonably high, or give the beer enough body?
So yeah, I would say the biggest and best thing to use is maltodextrin. That is going to guarantee that it will not finish, unless you add an enzyme into the fermenter, which I would not normally recommend. But some of these, like a Milo 300, that works right in the fermenter. It works even at like 30 degrees. So you don't really want to use it in a fermentation scenario, because it will guarantee that you're going to finish out, and it's going to convert the maltodextrin even to sugars. So that's a big thing to be careful of. But I have heard of gluten-free brewers that have done it because they've got a stuck a ferment at, like, say 1030. But I would say buckwheat is.
Now, since maltodextrin is not fermentable, can you possibly add it even after fermentation is done?
Yes, you can.
That was my guess.
You can do it, and I'm going to do it on 2 of the beers that hit a really vigorous secondary ferment. So this isn't federally legal, but it is legal in the state of California where I'm filming. And I decarboxylated marijuana and put it into an IPA that has now been fermenting for the past 3 weeks after it finished a 2-week ferment. So I don't know how much sugar was actually in that plant, but I did cook it for 2 hours at 220. And I know it's going to be like 0 or something even lower potentially. So I am already planning on adding about maybe a pound or a half pound of aqueous maltodextrin that I've boiled for a couple minutes and then cooled back down. And then I'm going to add that into basically the keg, because the maltodextrin, when you mix it into the water, and you don't want to use too much, but you still want to use enough in there. And I usually only get about 4.5 gallons into the keg anyway, so I'm not worried about adding a little bit of extra volume, because it's probably already going to be about 8%, or maybe 8.5%, because of the additional points of gravity that it's been losing by continuously fermenting.
I think you mentioned lactose is another alternative, right?
True. So I'm dairy intolerant as well as gluten-free. We won't get into that. That's a different episode.
Okay.
But lactose is also a thing that I've seen used quite effectively in gluten-free beer recipes. And, you can also use unmalted grains. That's not a bad idea either, but you really want to make sure that you boil off, because there will be a starchiness that you can sometimes pick up if you use enough of it.
So I'm thinking like unmalted wheat is a possibility then?
Well, not in gluten-free brewing.
No, I wouldn't think so, but
so say like unmalted buckwheat, or unmalted, you use chestnuts or lentils as kind of that extra protein element that would give extra body. But I would say that using
flaked oats is one that comes to mind, I guess, maybe.
I wouldn't buy flaked oats from your local homebrew store, because it's probably used on the same equipment that they use the flake barley on, so it might not be the safest. But you can use the rolled oats, or you can toast your own oats at home. There's a couple different kinds of things that you can do, because Bob's Red Mill has a couple different gluten-free
Quaker quick oats, right?
I don't know about quick oats.
The quick oats actually are, yeah, they're torrefied or I can't remember, flaked, I think.
Are they gluten-free though? So that's the thing.
That I don't know.
In order to be certified gluten-free, there's a couple different specifications that have to be met. And so that's why I don't always necessarily recommend that on Moss.
Yeah, I think they're, as far as I know, if you buy flaked oats from the grocery store or whatever, I think it's 100% oat. It's not, it doesn't have a bunch of other stuff in it.
That's great. So I think that's really, it's really about trusting the supplier. And that's usually what it's all about in the gluten-free space. So that, like, if you go to like a Whole Foods though, you have a cornucopia of different kind of grains that they have, because they have sorghum and amaranth and teff and quinoa and a couple different colors of quinoa at that. And they have millet, and they have all these different kinds of things. Sometimes they have puffed stuff that's really kind of fun to work with in a mash. And then that sometimes can also add a little bit of residual body back into the beer, because, you might even want to do a separate mash with it and then add that back after you've already racked the beer into secondary and, dropped all the yeast out, because that would also potentially add that body back. But, if you are using some of these unmalted ingredients in a mash, you can still convert starches because these enzymes are basically for that specifically. And that's basically the reason why we use these, is because of the fact that since it is such a low enzyme content, we're treating it like it almost is an unmalted grain in and of itself.
Well, are there any other considerations that come into play as you start fermenting and finishing gluten-free beer?
I've seen the use of, say, like the first 3 days of keg carbonation going to like a really high point and then dropping it down pretty low. And that way you'll get that lacing aspect. Otherwise, I think the biggest thing is to relax, crack a homebrew, and enjoy everything, because you're going to have probably your first 5 brews you're not going to be satisfied with at all, because you're still figuring out the taste profiles of these gluten-free grains and what you like and what you don't. So that's where I would recommend the first couple recipes doing as much as you can, and just really playing with your idea of what you think a beer is, because you don't have to use all malt. There are gluten-free breweries out there that are still using candy syrup as their main fermentable, and then doing a mash of unmalted grains to get residual body into the beer, and then fermenting the candy syrup out into the beer, but using a regular hop schedule as you would a beer, boiling it for 60 minutes. It's still kind of a beer, but it would almost suggest, since there's no malt, like a seltzer, but it still has hops in it, it still has grains in it. Well, then it's a beer, right?
Sure it is.
I think there's just really a lot to play with. I've seen people using like lentils, chestnuts, and elder catkins to get a malt vibe in the beer, and then using some sort of like sorghum or corn syrup or tapioca syrup. There's a lot of different things, and it really just depends on what's local to you. I think that's always been the case with brewing in and of itself. And for the gluten-free brewers out there, I'm out here working, and we got to work together, and we got to get the weed eaters to help us out, because we need to take back the word regular. I have too many people go regular beer, regular beer, regular beer, and it's what but it's a barley beer, because you can make millet beers, you can make buckwheat beers, you can make rice beers, you can make corn beers. There's a lot of different beers you can make out there, and so the term regular actually includes all malts. And so I think the big thing to focus on is, as gluten-free brewers, we're taking back the word regular.
Sounds good to me. Except that might not work out with the Reinheitsgebot police, but I don't know.
We'll see. I would really love to see a transition in the European law sets, because it was about 2006, really, that this all really came to a bigger understanding in a national context in America specifically, at least the United States, where there was a specific law that was passed where malt had always been synonymous with barley, and then there was a specification where barley was no longer needed to be a 25% base ingredient in the resulting product to be labeled a beer. And that's where you saw companies like New Grist, which is from Lakefront Brewing. They came out with their, New Grist Pilsner, which is a Pilsner. It is a sorghum-based Pilsner style beer. And it really kind of put it on the map, so much so that Anheuser InBev came out with a beer called Redbridge, which is also a sorghum-based lager-style beer. So, and they still sell that to this day. Coors came out with a copper lager that was discontinued in 2006. But right about that time is when you saw companies like Holidaily already kind of gaining ahead of steam as a local brewery that's gluten-free, dedicated to Colorado area. I think they are also in multi-state at this point, like companies like Ghostfish and Groundbreaker. Ghostfish is in Seattle, Groundbreaker is in Portland. And when you look at the map now, there's 12 dedicated gluten-free breweries where that's literally all they make. And then there's about 19 to 20 other 100% gluten-free brands that use no barley, wheat, or rye. They do sometimes work on shared equipment, some of them, And so that's where it wouldn't be a dedicated gluten-free beer. And that is a concern for some people that are anaphylactic. For others, there is, if there's no gluten, I see, say locally in Southern California, there's a brewery called Skyland Ale Works where the, head brewer just got diagnosed as a celiac. So they want to use the brew house to brew some gluten-free beers so that he and the people that he knows could come and drink beer at the brewery, and have it be 100% gluten-free. So they test the water that goes into the mash kettle before they even add any of the grains to make sure that the water itself tests. And that's a great way to do it, really, because when you look at tests like the ELISA F5, which has been the common practice in America for the last about half a decade, it is actually unreliable in the presence of alcohol. It is actually more reliable to use mass spectrometry or a mass spectrometer, if you will. I don't necessarily know.
Probably not cheaper though, right?
Not cheaper at all.
Yeah.
But
everybody's got a mass spectrometer laying around.
Right? But I think that there's
very common in the brewery.
But so there's this aspect where when you test it under a mass spectrometer, we're finding gluten particles per million in some of the gluten-reduced beers that is 100 parts per million or higher. That's
pretty high, yeah. I think you can cut it down below that just with enzymes, right?
And that's what you would think. And so that's the worry, is that there are batches that are potentially getting out there that are doing harm. And
have
that's
a lot
where
of content, yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why a lot of us in this gluten-free brewing space have kind of been philosophically opposed to a gluten-reduced beer or dogma, is because it still contains gluten. Like, as somebody goes, well, it's gluten-reduced, it's 5 parts per million. And here's my response. Oh, so you're telling me that there's gluten in it? Thank you. I won't drink it then.
Well, I mean, obviously some people are more sensitive than others. It very much depends on what your sensitivity level is, I would think, right?
And that's true.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to, step
I
a couple
understand.
levels up in terms of soapboxes, but I think that there's a certain level of where if we're gluten-free, we're gluten-free. And that's what we're really looking to do. Is if it can be done, we want to do it, and we want to try, and we want to, I think that there's a lot of people that, if you look at, say, the Zero Tolerance Gluten-Free Homebrewing Club, which in its first year gained up to, I think, 200 members, and in our second year now we have 400 members. It's staggering to see not only the involvement that this chapter gets, but the fact that we do monthly podcast meetings. And, those are all available on the Facebook page. You can go and view those. You can go and learn as quick as possible. We want to make kind of that lexicon for gluten-free brewing so that
maybe can you mention the Facebook group or the group there?
Absolutely. So the name is Zero Tolerance Gluten-Free Homebrewing Club. It's moderated by Joe Morris, and just the rich content on there from not only home brewers but professional gluten-free brewers is incredible. And the outpouring that you really see from people all over the world. I think we have 400 members on 5 continents or something kind of staggering like that, where you're like, wow, this is kind of a big deal now.
Awesome. Well, Robert, I wanted to ask you for your closing thoughts really quick, and maybe mention your brewery one more time here.
Thank you. Yeah, so my name is Robert Keefer. I am the head brewer and president of Divine Sciences Brewing here in Southern California. Just really honored to be a part of your show, Brad. But I think one of the things that I wanted to close with in terms of the gluten-free brewing, the gluten-free brewing is for everybody. It doesn't matter who you are. You probably know somebody, and that you always see them not getting a seat at the beer table, if you will, when everybody's having a pint. And I think that's what may have inspired a lot of people to come on the show. And that's where we really want to say wheat eaters welcome, in all shapes and forms, just as long as you don't use wheat, barley, or rye when you brew the beer for us. And that's something that for us, we really feel it. And for me, when I went gluten-free in 2010, it felt like a social death certificate had been signed, right? Instead of getting asked out for beers, that kind of went away because I couldn't drink beer. And so I think the biggest thing is bringing that back and really opening up your spectrum of what you consider a beer to be. Let yourself not feel that outside pressure to use all malt. Feel free to play around with it, especially at first. I know a lot of people really only have easy access to extracts that are gluten-free, and by all means use those. A lot of the most award-winning gluten-free beers out there are extract-based beers that are gluten-free extracts. So I really have no problem with it, and I think the scoreboard really shows that. So, really lean into the taste that you're getting out. If you're getting a certain level of sweetness from, say, a Belgian candy sugar, maybe use a little bit more hops. I think there is a certain level where you can balance certain flavors that you're getting from a gluten-free beer, and sometimes you can lean into those flavors and make an even better beer just by getting more used to the ingredients that you're using.
Well, thank you, Robert. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
As always, Brad, really appreciate it. Thank you again for having me on the show.
And my guest today was Robert Keefer. He's an avid gluten-free beer brewer and now a professional brewer, as well as author for Brew Your Own magazine. Thanks again, Robert.
Thank you.
A big thank you to Robert Keefer for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They're currently offering 20% off their all-access subscription pass with access to videos, brewing courses, exclusive articles, and the amazing Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Go to beerandbrewing.com/BeerSmith to get your all-access pass today. Again, that's beerandbrewing.com/BeerSmith. And also Blickman Engineering with the new Brew Commander. The Brew Commander is the new brew house controller available in electric and gas propane models. The patent-pending Brew Commander is an innovative, high-quality brew house controller with ultra-high precision and the ultimate in flexibility. Command your brew day with the new Brew Commander from Blickman Engineering. Order yours today. Visit blickmanengineering.com for more information. Again, that's blickmanengineering.com. And BeerSmith 3 is available now for download on both desktop and mobile platforms. BeerSmith 3 adds mead, wine, and cider support, new whirlpool hop options, support for high-altitude brewing, and a whole lot more. Check out BeerSmith 3 and get your free 21-day trial today from BeerSmith.com. Again, that's BeerSmith.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great brewing week.